Can you get a shot at it there? Laura, there you are. Gary, get your hands off that magazine. There you are. There she is on Cosmo. She is one of the most in-demand models of the world. A little something for yourself. Please welcome Christy Turlington. It's nice to finally meet you. I see you in all these magazines. I should wish you a happy birthday. Isn't it like tomorrow or the next day?
Saturday.
Saturday?
I'll be 24 on Saturday.
24? Really? Man. Wow. Well, boy. Planning a big party? You gonna do the whole?
No, I'm going to Lake Tahoe, actually. My parents have a house there, and we'll be spending just a quiet birthday party.
Not anymore. Suddenly guys all over America are on their way now to Lake Tahoe. Yeah. Now, what is this you're doing for the Museum of Modern Art? What is that?
Well, the Museum of Modern Art, well, actually, Museum of Metropolitan Art. They asked me to pose for a mannequin they're using for their Costume Institute. And they did about 140 mannequins based on my face. And they did men, children, women, and also women from the 16th, 17th centuries, smaller, rounder versions.
So they say your face would be sort of what? Typical, just a pretty face, or typical of 20th century woman, or something?
Well, they tried to choose a face that would go through all the periods. Some place that could be chameleon-like from the 16th century to now. And I'm very flattered that they asked me.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist. This is your host, Byrne Power, coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia, on another blue, wonderful, perfect day. Not too hot, not too cold, just right, with all sorts of greenery budding everywhere. So, why are we here today? Every now and then, someone says to me, "You must have all sorts of stories, Byrne," or "What else has happened?" People are interested in things that have happened to me. And the truth is, I did do an autobiographical question and answer session. It was over a year ago, a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. It was a while ago. And I answered people's questions. But one thing I hinted is, no one's ever actually going to ask the questions. They'll ask the questions about, what was life like during the Jesus movement, Byrne? What was life in New York City? What was life like in, California or Alaska? Did you see any bears? All these kinds of stories. I don't mean to say that you guys sound like that, but you get these little voices in your head, and some of them are, predictable because some of the things I've done have been predictable. But then there are the things which you can't guess. You have no reference for them. And even if I were to tell you a somewhat complete narrative of my life, these things might not fit in. And so, and they're interesting stories, not so much for me being there as the people and places that I have met and seen are just fascinating. And I find these stories, whenever I tell some of these, people say, "Oh, really?" And it's because you had a chance. In this case, we'll be doing anecdotes about people who are famous. Now, fame is a relative thing. Some people are very famous. We've got at least one in the top layer in this video. But then there are people who are famous. For instance, some of these people are famous for being musicians. Now, if you don't pay attention to musicians, or if you live in the 21st century and most of your experience has been in the 21st century and not in the 20th century, then many of these names may be a bit on the obscure side, but that doesn't make them any less famous. And so this will be the first in this series of anecdotes. And the anecdotes overall will range from people I have met, to places I have been, to events I have taken part in, I was actually just thinking as I was talking here about, there are all the things that I witnessed which are kind of dark and violent. That might make a good anecdote episode. And then I've got a few that are actually people I've met who are pretty well known or should be well known, and much longer stories. But we're not going to do any of those, nor am I going to do anything related to Georgia. I've obviously met quite a few people here, and some people by Georgian standards are very well known. By American standards, it's obviously not, or European standards, but that doesn't make a difference. They are fascinating people, but I can't fit that into this, nor am I going to deal with puppetry. I have been interviewing puppeteers for years, and I've met people like the Quay brothers and Jan Schrankmeyer and some people very important in Eastern European puppetry and French puppetry and such. So, but those people, no, sorry, they're all going in maybe another video we'll discuss things like that, but that's still in the offing. So, before we get into this, I would like to recommend a like, please. Just hit like if you like what I do. If you're a longtime friend, just hit like. It'd be nice to have as many views as many likes with just a couple of people who forget or dissent. I don't really check the numbers on how many people I get who are dislikers. But also, you might feel like subscribing if you haven't. The truth is, some people look at their statistics and they say, how come 63% of the people who watch my channel aren't subscribed? I guess I just don't have that much viral stuff. The vast majority of people who watch my channel are subscribed, which means I'm working tooth and claw to get every little subscriber I can. And also keep this in mind. Being as the fact I live in Tbilisi, Georgia, nowhere in America, not that Georgia, but this Georgia, I am not able to monetize these videos whatsoever. Recently, the Jonathan Peugeot video I did have a lot of people watching it who aren't regular subscribers. It's, suddenly pumped up to, like 8,000 people for within a week or two. That's pretty good for me. That is the best I've done. But many of those people aren't subscribed. But I did get a bunch of new subscribers out of that, and that's wonderful. But the point is this. I don't get anything. I put a lot of work into things and really don't get much at all from it. So if you feel like supporting the channel, you say I'm coming around to this, then there is a PayPal link below. And a hint, if you put in more than $50, or there's the PayPal link will say, well, do you want to pay by month? If you put $10 or more in a month, then you will get some audio extras. So look out for that. Okay. People I have known. Now, if you know names like David Bowie, Lou Reed. Speaking of Lou Reed, let's do our Lou Reed story here. Lou Reed, no, we're going to save that for a moment, just because it'll make sense in the flow of things. But if you know names like that, then you probably heard of the name Brian Eno. Brian Eno has been kind of behind the scenes quite a bit. He's produced quite a few albums. He was in Roxy Music, the original Roxy Music. Then he left that, did albums on his own, but then became well known as a producer after producing people like David Bowie and the Talking Heads. So Brian Eno is someone quite well known in the music world, particularly if you know anything about how music is made. Brian Eno is your man. I used to work at an extremely large, shall we call it, media store, because they had TVs and record players. This was like around between 1980 and 1984. Loads of vinyl. CDs hadn't come in yet, but eventually I was there when they came in. And they also had a whole store just for classical music. A whole store just for jazz. We had a whole room for disco music, which included rap music and such. Just a whole place where a guy was playing music all day, but fortunately it was walled off so we didn't have to hear it. And then there was a huge floor. And I think I mentioned some of this on my dumb questions video. I have a video on asking dumb questions, and I got some really wonderful dumb questions. But as I had a manager there who was just kind of insane, but great and wonderful, just this real Bronx, New York character. And he would say things like, in America, you say the customer is always in the right, meaning you have customer service is king. Now, if you're coming from Europe, this doesn't mean much for you. If you're a Georgian, this doesn't mean much for you, because checks. What's customer service? Well, it just means you pay, we give. That's it. Whereas in America, it's like, are you satisfied? And if the customer brings up some sort of issue with your meal or your product, it's like exchange like that. I was just exchanging one pack of AAA batteries for the identical size and amount of AA batteries at a store here. And they needed to literally see my passport. Just like, what? Because I'd picked up the wrong one earlier that day and then went back. It was just, any American would be cringing, whereas people here are like, well, that's what you do. And I'm sitting there going like, oh, you have no idea. Anyway, New York is not a place where the customer is in the right. In fact, my manager above me, a really wry kind of guy, looked a bit like Tom Petty, would say things to me like, the customer is always in the way. I mean, we set up all these records and have them beautifully displayed, and then people come in and mess it all up, and that's how we looked at it in New York. Anyway, huge store. I worked as a buyer there, meaning I worked with all the guys who came in to sell us stuff, and I was also in charge of all the music that was like international music. We didn't call it world music then, and I still don't like the name world music because it always suggests overproduced, Americanized, westernized stuff, whereas international music was really exotic. And I have so many records from that period, but I'm not going to go into all of that. But it was also country music and reggae, and I had whole rows of French and Italian music and British folk music. I also was in charge of the hardcore punk and the heavy metal, the obscure heavy metal stuff, the black metal and the speed metal and all this other stuff. So I was used to dealing with a lot of people with a lot of wild questions. And I'd see people come through. Now, we were down in Wall Street. Literally, I would hate to have been in this store on September 11th, 2001, because it was almost across the street. It was about a block and a half away, in direct line of sight from the World Trade Center. And I remember, though, we would get a lot of Wall Street businessmen who'd come in there. We would get people coming down just because we had so much. And I made sure I was given free rein to get whatever I wanted. And I got some of the most obscure titles possible. And as a result, people came down because we had this weird stuff that, I was really proud about. Anyway, one day this guy walks in, and I'm looking at him and I'm going like, that kind of looks like Brian Eno. We'd often get people who were somebody making music because it was an interesting store. It was just so big and so full of stuff. And I looked and I said, I looked at the record covers, and then you realize all the record covers, his face was distorted on purpose. But I looked and I said, yeah, it looks like him. A little shorter than I imagined. And I said, okay, I'm going to walk up to the guy and ask him if he needs help. If he talks with a British accent and asks for something super obscure, it's Brian Eno. So I walked up to the guy and I said, do you need any help? And he was looking down at the Middle Eastern records. That's a sign right there. And he said, I was looking for Omar el-Shari, Egyptian organist. Bingo. We didn't have him. I got him in a couple of weeks. And fortunately, I had those kind of connections. That's how crazily completist we were. But as soon as he said that, I said, okay, it's Brian Eno. And I didn't make a big deal out of it. I just simply said, Oh, you like that? Well, what about this and this and this and this and this? Because obviously, this was about the second year I was working there. Obviously, I knew my stuff by then. And this is about 1982. And so we were talking about, he had produced an African record, which was not that good, quite frankly, and he knew it. He kind of apologized for it. But we had lots of talks. We talked, at this point, I was just starting to make tape collages, and I had a friend of mine named Steinsky, I should put him down, who also made tape collages, except he made like cut and paste kind of wheels of steel stuff, some of the first real serious sampling in music. But I was making these things that were just long and drawn out with stuff, kind of percolating. And I'd been doing something like this since about 1975, just at home with 2 cassette recorders and, playing over each other and such. But since I was in New York, I was playing a lot more with that. So we were talking, and I was telling him about some of the stuff I was doing, and he was kind of interested in it. I wasn't trying to get a record contract because at that point, nobody was thinking I could make something out of somebody else's music and sell it to people. At that point, you just had something like Grandmaster Flash on the Wheels of Steel, where they would cut different records together as they were doing it live. But it was, by the 90s, tons of people were doing what I was doing. But I never felt like pursuing it because I could kind of see the end already, that it was just like, no. But anyway, we were talking, and I would mention things to Brian Eno, like, what I'd like to see is I have this idea of a video where it's just like you look, using the closed circuit television, just kind of like look down this one place, and something happens only now and then. And he loved that concept. He was less interested in the story than just the empty space. What we now call liminal spaces, and it's kind of an internet and YouTube sort of fetish these days, where people watch these weird, mysterious videos and such. And I suppose I have some stuff like that, but on another place that most of you haven't found yet. So, anyway, we were talking, and I got to know him, and he would come and go. And there was another girl who worked there who just had the biggest crush on him. She loved his music. She liked his more popular music, Taking Tiger Mountain, stuff like that. But I liked a lot of what he did. I particularly liked the ones he did with Robert Fripp, and some of the stuff that he did, especially the Apollo music that he did, became pretty famous as a background for certain movies later. So anyway, she walked up one day when she saw, this was after he'd been there 2 or 3 times, and we were having pretty good conversations. And she walked up, and she gushed on about, I just love your music and stuff. By the way, if you ever meet someone who's pretty well known, the thing you shouldn't do is say, I love your work so much. I mean, yeah, you can say, I respect what you do. But the more overboard you go, the more you act like, I can hardly breathe, that kind of thing, the more you're just alienating them. Because they don't want to be seen as gods. They want to just be seen as human beings. Anyone who's done something, they want to be respected, but they don't want people to bow down in front of them. Except for a few kind of perverted people. But, Marilyn Manson, I'm looking at you. But, most people are, who achieve some sort of fame, really get nervous is the wrong word. Queasy is probably a better word, around people who fawn over them. So, anyway, she came up and she was fawning all over him. And so what she did was, the next time she came over there, he had made that time, she had made such a big thing, and I kind of backed off because I didn't want to get in the way of the gushing. But he was actually really nice and bought her his, I like this, his African-produced album, which wasn't selling really. So he bought a copy for her so he could get his own royalties, and then signed it and gave it to her. And I'm sure she still treasures it to this day. But then the next week, Mick Fleetwood of Fleetwood Mac had made an album with, in Africa, the way Paul Simon made an album in Africa later, where it was just the same regular stuff, but without any it didn't sound particularly African. It just sounded like some Western guy using African background and whatnot, using a bit of Africanism. So she bought that for him on the next time he came in and gave it to him. Yeah, that wasn't a big thing. He never came back after that. And I think it was because essentially that kind of like, oh my goodness stuff really weirds people out who've done something because it has no content. You see, if you want to get to know someone who has done something, you'd better have something intelligent to say about things they're interested in. Which means you can't just simply say, I like your music, what's next, and all that. Asking what's next isn't a bad thing, but it just gets to be too much. So this was J&R Music World. And I think if I met Brian Eno today, I mean, he's probably about 10 years older than I am, but if I met him today and just reminded him of that, he would immediately probably recognize me because we spent a fair amount of time talking in the 3 or 4 times he came there. Speaking of Lou Reed, I did meet Lou Reed once. And the way it worked was like this. I was in a store, this other record store I worked in, which was like a small independent store. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But we had to get a key out to open up the cabinet that had all the CDs and cassettes, the different cabinets that had these. Because in New York, if you didn't lock that, everything would be stolen because that's the nature of living in New York City. So one day I'm in the store and there's this guy over by the Lou Reed, the Velvet Underground bootlegs we had. We had actually a very good collection of different bootlegs that someone jobbed in the store. It wasn't ours, but it was this guy working through the store. I did a similar thing where I bought and sold record collections and did it out of the store and cut the profits in 3 with the manager, the store owner, the person selling me the record collection, and myself. But, so this guy is sitting there and getting kind of like, hey, can I see this? Can I get in here? Can you get the key over here? And I'm looking at the guy and I'm going like, what does he think he is? Lou Reed? And then I go like, oh no, it is Lou Reed. And he was just exactly like the Lou Reed you expect. Kind of New York-y, kind of terse. He wasn't angry, he was just being a New Yorker. And I went over there and helped him, but it was kind of funny. Well, someone he worked with was Robert Quine. Now, Robert Quine appears, I think, most prominently so that people would know him on Richard Hell and the Voidoids' Blank Generation album, and particularly that song. And he does an incredibly, what can I say, abstract, really postmodern guitar solo in the middle of that, where rather than trying to get a nice, pretty sound out of the guitar, or technical sound out of the guitar, he just breaks the sound down, and it sounds like the lead guitar is just tripping over itself as it's falling down, and it's a wonderful sound. I mean, the music was there.
I belong to the blank generation, and I can take it or leave it each time. Well, I belong to the generation, but I can take it or leave it each time. Take it.
This guy was a brilliant guitar player. He was kind of balding head, had glasses, always kind of walked in like he was half asleep, going like, hey, how you doing? And we always called him Bob, and he would come in quite often. I got to know him fairly well. In fact, one time I was saying, hey, if you want to hang out sometime, he goes like, yeah, I'm really antisocial. And he wasn't saying that to blow me off. He was saying that because he was genuinely antisocial. But he would tell us things. He would come in going like, yeah, I'm going to be working on the new Lou Reed album soon. And he would talk about what the concert was like when he was playing in Italy or something like this. And while he was there, he was very friendly because none of us bowed down to him at all. We just talked about music. Secret, if you're dealing with a musician, try talking about music. if you know anything. If you don't, just say, hey, like your work, and stop. Back up. Do not approach unless you're one of those people who have to get an autograph. But then just know, if you have to get an autograph, you don't really... I'm just going to stop right there. If you have to get an autograph, you didn't really meet the person as much as it was a quick... I preferred actually getting to know people. And New York was a place where you could get to know people. Now, one of the things... the sad part was around 98 or 99. I had left New York for a couple of years. I hadn't seen him for a while. But then I heard he just basically committed suicide. And it was very sad, and I can't say I was really surprised. I mean, part of the reason I wanted to talk with him was not because I wanted anything from him, but because, to invite him out to hang out, it was because I sensed the guy was living alone. And he wasn't living alone. He did have a girlfriend, but social isolation, and it will do things to your mind. Nevertheless, great guitar player. So, I mentioned the smaller independent store. I actually stopped working at JNR Music World on December 31st, 1984. And starting in 1985, I was no longer working there. I had some delusion that I wanted to go out and write a novel. I'm just absolutely blown away by the stupidity of myself at this moment. I had no job, although I did do some work helping other people who were in the music business. But it was just I'd written a novel in that time, which was good. Nothing I'd want to show anybody today, but nevertheless, one has to try to do something. And eventually, I worked in some other places, which aren't going to come into this story. But I did end up in, what was it? About 1991, I started working at a place that was across the street from where I was living at the time in Soho in New York City, in Manhattan. And it was this place called Rocks in Your Head. And Rocks in Your Head was a small independent record store. And I met several people while working there. One of them was Tom Verlaine, really Tom Miller. And he was a guy from Baltimore, like his friend Richard Hell, who was in Richard Hell and the Voidoids, whom I also met, but much more briefly. Tom Verlaine came in there. He would come into the store. The interesting thing about that store, just absolutely crazy stuff, was that the owner would everything was done with cash. No, we did have a credit card machine, but the way he counted out, or I was supposed to count out at the end of the day, was just absolutely crazy. But the nice thing is, once he left, while he was there, I was just like a little dog. He'd go, could you do this? Could you do that? Could you do this? And the second he left, it was like I did everything. And probably better than him. And I'm not bragging. We called him the little sausage, or in joking, the petite saucisse. Because he was just like this little guy who was just like, looked like a little sausage. That's all I can say. But we all joked about him. But while he was, the different ones. But often, at least one day a week, I worked there, not that many days a week. I was buying and selling record collections at this point. So I worked between 15 and 20 hours a week there. And as soon as he would leave, I would just take over the store, and suddenly it was a place where you could talk to people, get into lots of interesting conversations, because that's what I think retail business is about. Selling the stuff should take a second place to the human relationships involved. And that's how I always looked at it. And so I made different friends while working there. But one person who came in was Tom Verlaine, who was with the group Television. He also had several of his own albums. And people who know the original punk story of what happened at CBGB's and that know Tom Verlaine and Television were a very important band. So, but this was now no longer the late 80s or even the late 70s or the early 80s. This was now the early 90s. But he would come in sometimes, and we would talk, and a lot of interesting conversations. But then he happened to notice that I was working on selling records, and he said to me, do you want to buy some records off of me to, would you like to do that or work something out? And I asked him, like, sure, how many records do you have? And he had a couple thousand, and some very, very obscure stuff. So I thought, okay, this is actually where I came up with this new idea for how to buy and sell record collections. Rather, if I was just going to buy a record collection, I would just go up and I would look at it, and I would try to get them all for $1 a piece, because I knew I had to process them all. And I didn't really know what everything was worth until I really went through it. So I would go through, now some people would say, hey, these are worth more than that, so I'd give them a bit more. But if they didn't know that, they were just trying to get rid of them. So that's fine. And in fact, what I would often do is pull out all the obvious stuff. Oh, here's a Talking Heads record, and here's a Michael Jackson record, and here's an Eagles record. And I put all those off to the side and go like, nope, I'm not buying those. Everybody has those. And at the end, they say, well, what should I do with them? Well, if you want, I'll take them. And I would sell them for like $3.99 or something like that. Because my thought was never take a loss. Always make money on what you buy. You don't want to take a loss. So if I'm not going to buy something that is way too cheap for me to sell. So anyway, he came in and we started talking. And so I went over to his house. He was a real smoker, and he was always coughing and such. Miraculously, all these years later, he's still alive. Did he stop smoking? Who knows? I went over to his house, and I looked in his house, and he had stacks of records piled up everywhere. And what he would do, he's a great guitar player, and the way he would get his sound is he would go over to some place that had lots of records cheap for sale. And we'd look for really obscure stuff. Here's a Hawaiian record. Here's an old jazz record. Here's a record from Greece. And he would listen for various guitar sounds. And once he digested it, it no longer interested him. But it interested me. So I looked at all this stuff, and that's when I made my offer. I said, okay, here's what we'll do. I didn't feel like spending $2,000 on records just like that. I didn't have it. I didn't want to do that. So I cooked up a new scheme, and the new scheme was to basically have him give me the records. And I told him, and I told a few other people this, I said, if you do it through me, here's how it works. You take a third, I take a third, and the store owner takes a third. If you don't do that, you get $1 a piece, roughly. In other words, and you're going to get far more this way. So, for months and months and months, he gave me the records. I brought them over to the house, and to the little store in Soho. And it took me a while to process them, but he had a lot of stuff that was worth something, and a lot of really obscure records. And people would come in and they would say, have you gone through more of those yet? And I made tons of money on that. And he made tons of money on it. Much more so than he would have made if I had just bought it outright. So that was good for everybody. Now a funny story. So you may have heard of the group Van Halen. They were very popular in the 1970s and early 80s. And one of the people who was most important in the band was the lead singer, David Lee Roth, who eventually in the early 80s decided to branch out on his own and become a solo performer. So he comes into the store, this little independent store. You see, we were in Soho, and Soho just attracts more artsy people and more artists. That's a whole category I forgot. Artsy people, famous people, celebs, what we would now call, people respected for what they do because they'd all come down to look at the art galleries and such, or they had homes in the area. Anyway, he walks in, and there's David Lee Roth. I'm not a particularly big Van Halen fan, and I have a rule. if I'm not a fan of the music, if Michael Jackson were to walk in, and I'm not a big fan of Michael Jackson, I would just be like, okay, there's this guy Michael Jackson, makes some kind of music, a lot of people buy it, so what? But, yeah, he was still somebody at that point, but he was in the zone of becoming less of a somebody and more of a, I wouldn't say a nobody, but somebody we remember from a certain period. So he's asking me to look around pull out a CD and look at it and such like this, and I'm doing this, and he's talking to me, and I'm not acknowledging who he is at all, because like I say, I don't think I have one Van Halen record at home. No, I don't. So, and then he's saying, he does this thing where he kind of sidles up to me. And it's really funny. He wants to still be hip. If you've ever seen the movie High Fidelity, you can't out-hip the guys at the record store when it comes to music. We used to get people who would walk into both JNR Music World and this little independent store, Rocks in Your Head. And they would come in with lists at the end of the year. The New York Times would have a list of the most important albums of the year, and they would just hand you the list. Anybody who did that, just handed you a list of stuff saying some critics said that was good, would immediately get our absolute opprobrium. We would just simply say, can you believe this person does not actually know anything about music? If you have to have someone else, get it for you. Now, in all fairness, there was no internet at the time. So you couldn't just look stuff up. It was very hard to hear stuff. But still, we felt a great deal of disrespect for people who did that kind of thing, because it just isn't the way to do it. You don't come in and hand us a list. I think my favorite one was when some guy at JNR Music World walked in and said, "Do you have any classical music here?" And I said, "No." He goes, "Not even one?" I think I said this on the Stupid Questions one. "Yeah, what do you think the chances are we'd have the one you're looking for?" I didn't say that, but I should have. Anyway, so David Lee Roth, trying to become hipper than thou, turns to me, and you can guess, if you know anything about me by now, you can guess how broad my musical tastes are, and says, "So what are you listening to now?" Another question you probably shouldn't put in that way. And I knew what he was doing. He just wanted someone to help him find some new music, because he was feeling he was losing touch with what people were doing. Well, what I was doing was certainly not. And I told him, you don't want to ask me, because I don't have taste like everybody else. I listen to really obscure stuff, or I listen to ethnic music, or I listen to old recordings. And he said, no, seriously, I'm really interested in what kind of music you're listening to. And I'm sitting there saying to myself, yeah, really interested, I'm sure. So I protested one more time. I said, no, seriously, ask any of the other salespeople here. There's a couple of other people at the moment. I said, they're probably what you're looking for. And in a way they were. They were much more connected with what was happening then, whereas, like I say, my tastes are kind of insane. So he finally turns to me and goes, you know who I am, right? And at that point, I think I'd been in New York City about 12 years. And I just said, yeah, I know who you are. That's a New York attitude. It's just kind of like, really? Are you trying to impress me? It isn't going to work. So I finally said, okay. And he goes, no, seriously, I want whatever you recommend, I'll buy. And I said, okay. So I opened up this cabinet. I put some music in that I had found up there. And I said, might as well get rid of one of my CDs. And I gave him a double CD of scratchy Greek recordings from the 1920s. And I said, here you go. And he took it and said, thanks. Maybe he actually got something out of it, because it was actually pretty cool music. So, one day, I remember working in the same little store. The supermodel, who is usually considered by most people to be the most representative supermodel of all the people who were really supermodels, before the term just became like, oh, she's a supermodel. But when it really meant there was only 4 or 5, maybe 6 of them in existence. And it was Christy Turlington, just absolutely beautiful young woman, walks into the store, and she's standing around the same spot Lou Reed was. And I noticed what happened. There were probably about, 15 people in the store at that moment. You could almost feel everybody's back straighten up. And everybody was suddenly their best self. Because she was so well known as a face. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of magazine covers. But also, she was so beautiful that it just changed the way everybody kind of was. And I think that is the effect of beauty upon people, is this strange sort of, something different would happen if, someone walked into the room and then you realized it was Elon Musk, and you're going like, wait a minute, he's so rich. And I think if someone walked in and it turned out to be someone on the level of Albert Einstein, they're so intelligent. We have these kind of responses to this sort of thing. If I can't think of a U.S., maybe if Barack Obama walked into a store or something, you would have that kind of feeling of, a lot of people don't like him, but you would still be like, oh, it's Barack Obama. Whereas you probably would think something very different if Trump walked into the room. Of course, each person brings their own essence. But, so, that was really fascinating to me. And I went over and helped her, and, she's just a normal person. And one thing I learned about very, very beautiful people, particularly women, is that they like being treated somewhat normally. At the same time, they can't escape being this image that they've become. Very fascinating. I wish I'd had time to talk with her. I have had friends who were fashion models in New York City, so I have talked to enough to that kind of person to develop some sort of repertoire. I did meet Lauren Hutton once, who was considered the most famous and probably the most iconic fashion model of the 1970s, and she was known for having a gap in her tooth, which was considered like, ooh, but she was totally beautiful. But I met her in the early 80s, mid 80s, and talked to her. It was with Malcolm McLaren. See, I didn't write all this stuff. I was just like, oh yeah, Malcolm McLaren. And we talked a little bit about fashion photography, and I asked what she was interested in, and she told me a few names. I told her I was kind of getting into some Japanese photographers, and she said, like, who? And then I felt like exposed because I didn't know those names off the top of my tongue, but I knew what they looked like because I'd been looking at Japanese magazines. Well, I mentioned buying and selling record collections there, and I remember one particular record collection had a lot of experimental music and early electronic music. And one of the people who was most into that sort of music was Thurston Moore, who was the leader of the band Sonic Youth. And one day he walks in. I'd seen him a few times before into this small store, and I never really talked to him because, there's Thurston Moore. I like Sonic Youth, but I don't have anything particularly to say. But now I did, because he would walk in and say, someone told me that there was like experimental music that you'd gotten in a shipment of old used stuff. And I said, indeed, we do. And so I'd go over there, and then we started talking because we had something to actually talk about. Turned out he was a real fan of early experimental music from the 50s, 60s, 70s. And so he was there to buy as much as possible, and he would go through it, and, I would be charging premium rates for it. That's $30 for that album. That one's $35, and I sold maybe $150, $200 worth of music to him. Early Philip Glass stuff. There was one that I sold for over $100. That's the kind of business I was doing, you see. So, we got to, I would stop him on the street. He lived in the Soho area at the time. And we would occasionally bump into each other and talk. But again, the point isn't to say, ooh, I met this person. The point is that I had a relationship based on talking about these experimental records. Of course, I had to kind of listen to them to make sure they sounded good. So I knew what I was doing. And I was learning something as well. That's what most people don't realize, is that when you get to know someone who knows their stuff, I'm digging it, and that's how my knowledge gets expanded. This really happened to J&R Music World in many different categories, but it happened again with him, talking with him about experimental and early electronic music. And this is one thing I'd like to say. If you're ever in the presence of someone whose work you respect, and you have the opportunity to discuss anything with them, the last thing they probably want to hear, unless they're really down and need some kind of attention, is, oh, I love your work so much. It's so, I have every one of your records and all of that stuff. It's nice, but most people who are noted for doing something. I remember once I was introduced to Nick Cave. And Nick Cave is an artist I really respect. And he's also gone through a philosophical journey. And I really wanted to talk to Nick Cave. However, I was introduced to him at a point where the old Tower Record store was there. And this was in the about 93, 94. And there were about 200 people outside waiting to come in to get autographs. And I took one look at him. My friend Larry Ratzo, Ratzo is the nickname he always went by, Sloman, Larry Sloman Ratzo, knew Nick quite well, it turns out. And so he was going to introduce me. He did. I said hi, I shook his hand, and that was it. Because I knew the last thing, as much as I wanted to talk to him, the last thing this guy needed was to try to talk to someone 5 seconds before going out and facing the horde. And all these people are going to be saying, oh, Nick, I love your... It's just like, okay, I get it. Let's not... It's like trying to talk to someone 5 seconds before they go on stage. You just don't do it. You're not going to have a big discussion about anything meaningful. You can say, I appreciate your work, something low-key. But as soon as you get into that fawning fan stage, unless the artist is someone who just can only live through attention, a real artist, and those are the people I'm interested in, people who actually have done something meaningful. A real artist wants to talk about the things they are interested in. So with Thurston Moore, it was electric music, electronic music, experimental jazz. With Nick Cave, I would love to have talked with Nick Cave about God and about nihilism and all these things. And maybe someday I will get a chance to do that, who knows. But alas, wrong moment to meet him. I would rather have met him after that. But even then, probably a little too close to being part of the show. One person I met that was not through any store, but I was going to see, it was the opening day of the movie La Bamba. It was the story of Richie Valenzuela, who tragically lost his life in the same plane accident that took Buddy Holly's life, and also the Big Bopper. And it was an interesting story to see. So I was there, and then I noticed I usually sit down near the front of any movie because everything else is television. And I noticed sitting not too far from me, little Steven Van Zandt of Bruce Springsteen's band, and he had his own band, the Disciples of Soul. And at this point, he was doing this video called Sun City, and this song came out it was like We Are the World, but it was about South Africa. And in that, he had gathered like Bruce Springsteen and Bob Dylan and the Ramones and Run DMC and African Bambaataa and all these people together to sing the song, I Don't Want to Live in Sun City. But my feeling was, noble as the sentiments were, they didn't want to play in this place that essentially was too connected to apartheid, which was still going strong. My feeling was, nice song, but ultimately it's propaganda. And so I bumped into him on the way out, and I started talking, and I mentioned this, and I just said, and we got into this heated discussion. It was great, though. It was a great heated discussion. We walked along up to from Times Square up to Central Park talking. And I said, yes, I understand that you had a message, but here's the problem. As soon as the message turns into propaganda, you see what it is you make it so that anybody who thinks anything slightly different is the enemy. And so you can't actually reach the people you want to reach. You don't get engagement, you just get a division, them and us. And so I just felt like, yeah, well, who's going to disagree about apartheid in America? You know, that's like obvious. So what you're basically doing is calling attention to this fact. But I just felt it was kind of a low blow. And we talked. And finally, at one point, I mean, I'm pressing pretty hard. I'm not that old. What am I? About, I don't know, heading towards 30 or something like that. But I'm pressing him on it, and then eventually he turns to me, but what other way was there to communicate this? And I thought about that for a long time, but I basically said to him at this point, there has to be other ways. And so that was an interesting meeting. I should have said, say hello to Bruce for me, but I'm not that stupid. I'm not there to check names off. As you can see, most of these things are about relationships with people who are respected. And how does one have that sort of relationship? Living across, I lived in this one building. Maybe I should just talk about this building, because it was a fascinating place to be. It was in the Lower East Side on Houston Street. Yeah, I'm going to save everything that happened in that building maybe for one spot, because there was musicians that lived in the house with me. There was a guy who was an art critic above me. Yeah, this separate series of antidotes. These were the anecdotes. Sorry, antidotes. I wish. This was one of the most fascinating, this was the most fascinating time in my New York City life, from about 91 to 95, or 95. And so it was 93 to 95 was there. It was like 3 years. But so much, this one building is just all the things that happened in this one building were enough to write a book about. And I'm not being one of those people, oh, you should write a book about this. I mean, seriously, everything from murders to drug overdoses to, crack dens to, and famous people in the building. It was just wild. But we're going to save that as a little, think about that. One person I'm really ashamed of having kind of done the wrong thing when I met them was when I was young, in my Jesus People days, around 1973, John Lee Hooker, who wrote the song There Ain't No Burnin' Hell, John Lee Hooker came by to this small place in Roanoke Park. Was it Roanoke Park? Yeah, Roanoke Park. They had this little place. Van Morrison played there one night. I never did see him, though. But I did. I saw him through the window, but that it kind of counts. But John Lee Hooker came to play there. This was in, like I say, about 73, 74. And what we were doing as Jesus People was handing, Jesus People newspapers out and stuff like that. We were trying to talk to people about Jesus. And John Lee Hooker, before he went in, we talked to him, and he said, we really love your music. And I said to him, and I was very familiar with his music by that time, because I'd had it in my first record collection. But we said, well, we just hope you think about Jesus. And he was just like, yeah, all right. And I look back later and I just said, oh gosh, that was stupid. But that's what you get when you stay in this propaganda mode. And I was propagandizing for Jesus in that way. In a way, I would later say, no, that's just not the right way to do it. There is a time for that sort of thing. There's a time for going out and passing things out and talking to people. But that wasn't it. And we made a big mistake at that point. And I remember the guy, just this squall of pain going over his face. I mean, at least I met John Lee Hooker. I can say that much. And, of all the famous bluesmen, it was nice to meet at least one. And then there's T-Bone Burnett, who is a Christian, and I met him a couple of times. The first time I met him, he was playing, I think, at the Lone Star Bar and Grill over in the West Village area, and I got there a bit ahead of time. Small venue. Maybe about 50 people came to see him, but he was sitting there with this rather large, kind of infirm man, older man, and he said, "This is Doc Pomus." And Doc Pomus was this guy who had written many classic rock and roll songs. We'll scroll some of them here. and when T-Bone Burnett had said, "Well, I'm going up there to get ready to sing," he said, "Why don't you talk with Doc Pomus?" And I knew what he was doing. He was saying, like, here's a bit of musical history. Get to know it. And I took him at his word. By that time, I was, of course, much more. This was New York City. What was this? Probably about 86 or so. And, but my conversation with him was basically, "Hey, T-Bone, I really like your work, and, just came to see you. I wasn't going to get into anything big." We talked for a couple of minutes. Then, several years later, it was probably 94, I had some friends staying with me at my apartment. And my one friend, Jeff, we were going to actually see T-Bone Burnett and his then wife, Sam Phillips, play at the Mercury Lounge. And Jeff was there, and Jeff saw a friend of his who he knew who was kind of related to all of this. So he went up and talked to him, and then he got us to meet T-Bone Burnett and Sam Phillips. And it was a really interesting discussion. I said something to T-Bone Burnett like, "I don't know if you remember me," and he didn't, because that's how it often is. If you're in the business where you meet too many people, someone has to really stick out for you to remember them. Just remember that. But we had good discussions. But I said to T-Bone Burnett, "This is probably better than playing the Christian circuit." And he said, "Maybe sometimes the Christian circuit isn't quite as lethal." And so, but we talked more at that point, and I felt like I'd connected in some better way at that time. And I think if I ever bumped into him again, he might recall me. But again, it's been a long time, and people tend to forget. People, especially if they're in the business of meeting people all the time, and he's about to do a concert, that's a whole different situation where it's very hard to remember someone at that point. So let's end up with one last person. This is probably the most famous person I've ever met. And this is, I used to work at Forbidden Planet. And Forbidden Planet still exists in New York City. It's a small, it is now a small store that sells lots and lots of fantasy, geek stuff, fandom stuff, has lots of books, horror, comics, science fiction, fantasy stuff. But at that time, it took up 2 huge floors and a third floor just for stock. And so lots of people came there. I remember seeing the guys from Ivy and Lux from the Tramps, Disco Inferno. The Cramps came in there looking for some really dodgy stuff. And in fact, that dodgy stuff was exactly what Robin Williams was doing there. Yes, Robin Williams, the comedian, the actor. This was about 86 or 87. And he came in, what the what Lux and Ivy from the Cramps were looking for was they wanted to see this one book we had behind glass. And the reason we had it behind glass was a French comic artist, Picard, whose work is so disgustingly pornographic. It's like black and white line drawings and such of the Marquis de Sade's work. And all I can tell you is, having leafed through it, it's just like, oh my goodness. I never even thought about buying his work because it was just so over the edge. This wasn't just like something edgy. This was on the other side of the edge. Well, anyway, the people from the Cramps obviously were in it. But Robin Williams was also into it. And I thought to myself, this is kind of odd. But then again, considering the circles he ran in, maybe they needed something that was just completely edgy. And anyway, he said, hey, can I get inside of this and look at it? So I opened it. And at a certain point, I said, I did the mistake. Robin Williams, too much for me. I fawned just a bit and then recovered. I said, how much I really liked his work. But then I realized what I was doing, backed off immediately, let him look through this disgusting book, which tells you something about the dark stuff running through his brain that would later lead to his own suicide. And we got to talking a bit more. I talked to him for about 15 minutes. We had a very interesting conversation, which ended up being about Jonathan Winters in the mental institution. I told him I was a big Jonathan Winters fan, and how we had what was it? I had spent time working in a mental institution myself. I spent about 6 months working in a crazy mental institution. There's a story for another day, Byrne. And I told him the story. Now, this will show you how, you wonder how much of what a person does on the stage is quick thinking, and how much of it is just they rehearse this over and over and over. And I was just about to get an absolutely amazing example of how quick Robin Williams' brain was, because I stunned him with my story, and then he immediately made the funniest joke out of it. So the story goes like this. I was working in this mental institution, and there was a guy named Brian who worked there. And he used to come up to me, and when I first started working there, he would ask me the same questions over and over. And he would say things like, hi, what's your name? Well, he eventually got the fact that my name was Byrne. And he goes, oh, hi, I'm Brian. And then he would say, now this guy kind of had graying hair. I couldn't tell if he was 60 or 40. He just had this indeterminate look. But then he says to me, what sign are you? And I said, I don't really believe in astrology. Don't really have a sign. And he goes, oh. He would keep asking me this every time I walk in. What's your sign? I'd have to explain to him again. Then one day, I remember the time, I walked in and he said, and this has been a part of my thought form ever since. He said, I have a candy bar for you. I wanted to give it to you, but I ate it. And I said, okay. He goes, but it's the thought that counts. And I often, every time anyone ever says, but it's the thought that counts, I think like, yeah, I had a candy bar for you, but I ate it. But it's the thought that counts. I was just like, really? The third thing he would often say to me every time I walked in, he goes, is my mother coming today? And I said, no. And he goes, oh, I don't, or I'd say like, I don't know. And he goes, oh. But one day I said, this was about the third or fourth day I was working there. I said, would you like me to find out if she's due to come? He goes, oh, yes, could you? And so I said, okay, well, let me go and find out. And I walked up to the nurses' stations, and one of the other orderlies, I was an orderly there, and the reason you had larger orderlies, because sometimes you had to do stuff that involved some serious physical restraining of the patients. I don't want to go into all of this story, although that might be a good one for the violence episode. But, so, I said to this other orderly, taller than I am, with some sort of afro, though he was white, and I said, so what's the deal with Brian? Is his mother due to come visit him sometime soon? The guy looks at me, just kind of like I'm a little insect, and goes, "You don't know, do you?" And I said, "No, what?" He goes, "Look in the patient's record book. It's that stainless steel book that flips up. Look up Brian." So I looked up, opened it, looked up Brian. Why is Brian there? What's in Brian's history? Mother had him castrated when he was 6 years old. So I told this to Robin Williams, who reacted with appropriate horror. Just like, whoa! You can imagine Robin Williams doing this. And then he turns to me with a kind of a twinkle in his eye, and he goes, "Brian, your mother's here, and she's brought something for you." I can't top that story. We are done for the day. So thanks for listening. We will do more anecdotes in the future. It just struck me as something that people might be interested in. If you are, let me know. If you go like, "Byrne, this is the worst thing you've ever done," let me know. I just don't want any more. If I get everyone saying like, "You suck, Byrne," then I will stop. I don't think I'll get that, but you never know. Well, remember, the Anadromous life means swimming against the stream, and you never know who you'll meet along the way. From Tbilisi, this is Byrne saying, keep swimming. Take care.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.
This is my real, honest feelings. I do not think that fame is, I don't think that people should aspire to it. I think it should be something that happens if people like your work, and then it's cool, it's fine. But I think there's way too much emphasis put on just trying to get attention. And it's being rewarded and supported in this weird way. There's nothing wrong with getting attention, but it should make sense. It should make sense. There should be some reason. And if it's out of balance,
yeah,
you should probably look at like why is it out of balance?